All right, I want to say welcome to everyone who's here at the Pathways to Fire Resilience panel discussion today. My name's Carrie and I'm with Trees Foundation, and we're thrilled to be hosting this webinar. It's our 30th anniversary. So this is in lieu of a big in-person celebration. We're postponing that until it's safer to gather, hopefully this spring. But today we have a wonderful and important conversation to have with a lot of very informed folks about fire resiliency and how to make our rural communities more resilient to fire. With that said, my colleague Anna Rogers will be helping with the slideshow today. And Anna, can you go ahead and advance to the next slide? All right. And this is where I let you know that there's both a chat and a Q&A. Harry Vaughn, hello. He has done a great job of introducing himself in the chat, and that's just what I was going to invite all of you to do. Go ahead and say who you are, maybe where you're from and why you're here. That chat is for your conversations there. And then as you have questions for the panelists, on the bottom toolbar, you should see a Q&A, it says. If you click on that, you can ask a question. We're going to let our presenters all present in the first hour, and then the second hour will be for Q&A. So if someone's speaking and you have a question for that panelist, go ahead and write their name and write the question right there, and we will try to get to it during our Q&A session. And we probably will get to all the questions. There's also a feature where if someone else has asked a question that you also want answered, you can upvote that question and make sure it gets answered. Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, this is where I'm going to invite Bill and Gail to also join me. And we are here to welcome you to this panel discussion today. It's really a delight to see Trees Foundation moving towards expanding our services more to the world of fire preparedness. And about this time last year, Tracy Cattleman, who used to be a big part of Trees Foundation back in the Headwaters days, she reached out to us and said, do you think Trees Foundation should expand to also offer the same types of services you offer to grassroots environmental groups in the North Coast, to also expand to doing that for the fire preparedness community? And when she and we all started to look at the expertise on our board alone in this area, it started to become clear that this is really an important direction for us to do. And so that's what's led us to really emphasize this today. And Bill and Gail can add to that, of course.
Well, this is Gail Eastwood. I'm interim chair of the Southern Humboldt Fire Safe Council, one of Trees' new partners. And I'm just really happy to see that Trees Foundation is embracing this world of fire preparedness and fire resiliency. I've been steeped in stewardship one way of the land, one way or another, for a pretty long time. And it seems to me that fire is the common denominator. It unites everyone. It's the concern that draws all of us into a deeper awareness of caring for the land is about survival. So thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Trees.
Okay, Bill here. I guess I want to add that this is really a very opportune time to be doing what we're doing. As we all know, I mean, fire is getting to be extremely serious, and we've really got to up our involvement on a single landowner level and all the way up to agencies. It just has to happen, because right now we're burnt. Nature is just doing it. It's burning large areas, and then it burns contiguous areas, and so I'm thrilled by the panel, and let's get on with it.
All right, well, great. And again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and you can also message us in the chat. So next slide, please, Anna. And this is our agenda. And as you can see, we're going to start with Allie, and then we will go to Margot Robbins, Lania Quinn Davidson, Tim Bailey, and Will Harling. There is one change in the schedule in that unfortunately Kai Ostro is not able to join us today. We certainly hope we can get him when he's better available another time. And it's certainly important to hear the perspective of first responders and volunteer fire departments. And we also have the ability, if there is anyone in the audience today, because I know we have an esteemed audience of people also very experienced in this topic, it is possible to bring someone on as a panelist that's an attendee. So if you have something that you want to add to the discussion, a perspective to share, just send me a message in the chat, and we can try to work on that so that we can really make this an interactive discussion. We don't want to just present, we want to hear questions and hear dialogue. So that's also a possibility. And with that, I will hand it over to Allie for our first presentation. I'm really excited about that. Oh, one more thing I wanted to add, and that's okay, Allie. Here's Allie Freedlund, is that Trees Foundation is hiring a new position. You can read about that on our website. Just go and it's the latest blog post is all about the job and how to apply. And that is a community fire resources coordinator. And one of the role models for this is to have someone working in Southern Humboldt, where we're based, where Trees Foundation is based, though we work to serve all of the North Coast. We're going to start locally and work on having someone in Southern Humboldt fulfilling a lot of the same types of roles that Allie has been doing for Lower Mattole and in the Petroleum area for several years now. So she's going to be a really great resource for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Allie.
Hey, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to Trees Foundation for getting this together. It was hard to let go of the in-person event, but this is great. I feel very honored to be a part of this esteemed group of panelists. And next slide, please. I want to say that at the Mattole Restoration Council, we have been seriously collaborating with the Lower Mattole Fire Safe Council for almost 20 years. And another thing that we really started in 1992, not the Mattole Restoration Council, but as part of the community, was something called NEST. Next slide, please. Well, not yet, actually. Sorry, Anna. The NEST is at the neighborhood level, and how important it is to engage and to know our neighbors. As I often quote Wendell Berry, love your neighbor, not the ones you want, but the ones you have. And sometimes I will change that to like your neighbor, not the ones you want, but the ones you have, because when you like them, then you are more engaged to go and account for them. And so that's where I'm going to start with getting to know your neighbors. And then I'm going to go on to a great avenue for exploration of building pathways to fire resilience is forming fire safe councils or being a part of the Humboldt County Fire Safe Council. In this list of things, I'm going to talk mainly about the ones that have asterisks after them, because a lot of my fellow panelists will be doing some of the other conversations. One of the key things in our communities is to support our volunteer fire departments or companies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And another key thing that in order to get the kind of funding support you need to do the implementation on projects, it often requires the building of plans, of prioritizing projects, whether that's a CWPP, which is a community wildfire protection plan, or being a designated firewise community, or now, as probably Tim Bailey will talk about, being part of a regional collaboration in order to expand from defensible space and fuel breaks to larger landscape fuels reduction. So for the Mattole Restoration Council, it became very important to build our capacity doing the actual work with our crew. And that has taken a long time. So when I give you that list, I want to say it's been 20 years of taking that time to build a lot of capacity. And then we're able to do the fuels reduction and or the good fire. So it's really important to work with all the people in the people pot, whether it's the funders, the agencies, your landowners, your neighbors. It just becomes a very interactive thing, and not stick people, not pigeonhole people in being that person and to try and avoid burnout. Lastly, the two things kind of go together. It's critical to reflect on what works in these treatments, on what works in getting together with communities, on being transparent, on noticing what's happening with your treatments when species change. What are you aiming for? What are you getting? Because it's more than just about your people neighbors. It's about your neighbors as trees. It's about your neighbors that fly and crawl and, you know, are furry. And so anyways, we'll get to that at the very end, but very little bit. I just want to say that's the big perspective. Next slide, please. So in 1992, we had a huge earthquake in Petroleum, which took houses off their foundations, and we started something called a neighborhood emergency service team. We didn't make this up. This was out there. This model was out there. But it really brought the communities of Petroleum and Honeydew together, in that all of a sudden people understood, oh, not everybody knew their neighbor, or what was happening, or whose foundation was lost, or is everybody alive? And so we started this nest, and this is just the first page. I'm not sharing the phone numbers. And in the beginning, it was very difficult because people didn't want to share their phone numbers. And now it still can be difficult in some areas, but all of Petroleum is in the nest list. And there's several pages to this list. Each nest is a bunch of residences, usually along the same road. And some of the larger road networks are broken up into 3, sometimes 4 different nests. And each nest has a representative that in an emergency would report to the volunteer fire companies and or the nest coordinator to account for people in an emergency situation. And we've used it many times since 1992. Now, next slide, please. We also, when we formed the Lower Mattole Fire Safe Council, we had a hard time getting all the representatives from all the neighborhoods. And then we thought, oh, it could be the same, because you don't do a lot with Nest unless you're in an emergency. And so we started advertising that all Nest representatives, please come to the Lower Mattole Fire Safe Council. And I'm showing you this photo just to say, this is not all our nests, but it does involve CAL FIRE, our volunteer fire companies and or departments. And it's a lot of us gray-haired folk that are able to take on that representation and find out who our neighbors are and what the numbers are and where the water tanks are. But don't feel like you have to shoot for the sky. This is probably a quarter of the Nest reps that are sitting here in this room. And we don't have a ton of in-person meetings, obviously, right now, but we go forward. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we go forward with is to support our volunteer firefighters or first responders. And we have a unusual, we are very remote out in Petroleum and Honeydew, and there's a lot of lack of ability to get a signal, as you guys might know in your areas. So we made up these atlases to show, because you can't get Google Maps when you're on an emergency out here. Most places, it's kind of crazy. It's starting to get a little bit better, but we started the Mattole Fire Atlas, and they became these huge 11 by 17 things that were put underneath the seats of the fire engine. And then we realized they were kind of cumbersome. Next slide, please. And we went on to go back to the Nest and update the nest list by going to each nest and making each nest into a map. And then going back to the atlas, next slide, please, where we are putting all the big information material onto iPads that have GPS tracking on them. And this is our GIS coordinator training the firefighters up in Edwardsburg at the Telegraph Ridge Fire Station, so that they can now take these iPads and know exactly where they are as they go on an emergency. Next slide, please. I'll take a breath. And that's been critical in our involvement of our whole community, is bringing on the fire fighters. Building crew capacity, I don't want to overwhelm people, but I think it's really important in every area to build crew capacity. And this has taken us 20 years, and we have all the chainsaws and the personnel and the chippers and the sod washer and the trailer and the log splitter and this and that and an equipment shed and a crew truck. And it has been incredibly important. But you just start with your personnel. You just start building a crew, and the rest should follow. And I know in some areas that has been a challenging aspect to get the labor, but I want to say it's going to get less challenging. Let's just put it that way. Next slide, please. So we started out doing a lot of defensible space projects, and then we moved on to roadside fuel breaks, and then we moved on to shaded fuel breaks within on people's private lands. And this is on a private ranch landowner. And we have predominantly been using good fire in burn piles. However, we are hoping to do more prescribed fire with the prescribed Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association. And it's just an important and incredible way to build resilience. We're talking about these pathways to fire resilience, and we just have to put fire back on the land, and we have to reduce those fuels in some way. Next slide, please. I'm not sure how much, you know, you're these people out here that are involved, but this is just a before and after of a location on one of our fuel breaks. We've gotten the fortune of being able to work in really incredibly beautiful places along incredibly beautiful wild ridge lines, but they still need, because of the absence of fire, they still need treatment. And so you can see that there was a lot of thinning done, and we also burned the material, and it's just sort of our before and after. But what this is my last slide, and I just want to say, it's about this. It's about place. It's about, you don't necessarily want to shoot for trees 15 feet apart and the exact park-like looking thing. You want to go, okay, what do you want? Do you want to retain the oaks? Do you want to, you know, release the madrones? What do you want? Are you trying to reclaim your grasses? Those sorts of things are the questions that we really need to address moving into those larger landscape fuel breaks and or forest health treatments. And so it's been an honor. I feel like as we go forward, we are reconnecting the web of where we can maintain a native diversity. And if one part gets a little shriveled up by fire, we can reconnect it again. If we keep a mosaic, if we keep that mosaic of all these different species in our minds and watch and see what is happening. All right. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Aikui Nicknow Margot Robbins, Keechnat, co-founder and executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council and co-founder and co-lead of the Indigenous Peoples Burn Network. Thank you, Allie, for sharing those great words. It was a very good message, and I'm happy to add to what you had to say. Traditionally, Native people used fire as a land management tool and in ceremony. Our ancestors burned from the coastline to the high mountain peaks. stewarding the forest to ensure healthy outcomes for the plants, the animals, and the people. Wildfire protection was a byproduct of these burn practices. The suppression era uprooted these natural land management practices, devastating the delicate balance of the ecosystem. In the face of the current climate crisis we are facing, it's imperative that decision makers heed the knowledge of thousands of years of successful land stewardship when we as Native people took care of the land we now call the United States. There has been significant progress in this last year towards incorporating Native perspectives and traditional ecological knowledge into the decision-making processes. There has been legislation passed addressing liability and insurance needs, and that also recognizing cultural practitioners and tribes' right to take care of the land with fire. Additionally, CAL FIRE has begun a program to start putting fire back into the hands of the people. The California Burn Boss program, which Lenya taught the first class, I heard it went really good, is a step towards putting fire back into the hands of the people. For that particular class, you'll have to have some basic fire classes and experience burning in, but at some point, the average landowner would be able to start burning their own land. The Cultural Fire Management Council is a nonprofit organization based in far northern California. And when I say that we're community-based, we are literally community-based. We started out as a handful of people with a driving need to bring fire back to the land. We didn't have any money. We didn't have any political power, but we had determination to do what needed to be done for our community. Your people are people that are basket makers. We use baskets for everything from birth until death, but our baskets require fire to burn the hazel, which is the base of our basket. So that was one of the reasons that we needed to bring fire back to the land. The other reason is that we were afraid that if there was a wildfire, our elders might not be able to escape. And so we started down this path of learning first, who controls fire? Who controls the use of fire? What are the laws and policies governing the use of fire? And what did we need to do to start using fire again on our landscapes? And that's what we did as a small community group. We did research and we found out what the rules are governing the use of power. We found out that you need to have basic entry-level firefighter qualifications. And so we had a community class and we brought in a burn boss that taught the basic 32 entry-level firefighting course. And so we had community members with qualifications to be out on a fire line. We connected with the Nature Conservancy who instituted the TREX model of burning on our homelands, and people from across the United States and sometimes even other countries come to help us burn our lands. And people have all levels of qualifications, from the highest level of incident command or burn bosses down to entry-level firefighters, some of them who have never been on a fire before, but they are trained up not in the classroom, but on the land. Fire is put into the hands of the people and they learn how to do it in a way that's not big and scary. It's not putting fire out. It is putting fire on the land in a good way to restore the land. And people learn that the land is meant to have fire on it. Our ecosystems depend on fire to be healthy. Not just the plants, not just the animals, not just the people, but even the water. Fire affects the water. Fire on the land increases the water table, and it purifies the water, the biochar that's left on the ground after a burn. It purifies the water. The ash that's left on the ground works its way into the soil, and it makes the soil healthy again. The plants that come back after a burn, that new growth, it's very, very nutritious, Animals always come back to the burns where we have burned. Every place we have burned, we see deer in there, we see woodpeckers, saw a flying squirrel even one time. I didn't even know we had flying squirrels in our ancestral territory. But with fire, the ecosystem comes back into balance. There are many ways that would be helpful to increase the pace and scale of prescribed burns and cultural burns. One is that tribal sovereignty needs to be recognized. We have inhabited these lands for thousands of years. Nobody knows better than us what our land needs. And it doesn't make sense that we have to get permission from somebody else to burn our own lands. Native people should have the right to burn in the right place at the right time. And when we're out on the land and we're burning for cultural purposes, this is a natural process. Our land was meant to have fire, and we as humans were meant to help put that fire on the land. We can't just wait for the lightning strikes to come. We need to take our place in the ecosystems and do what we were meant to do, which is to care for the land. And cultural burns should be exempt from air quality regulations because they are a natural process. You will see in this picture a few different kinds of burns. One is a prairie burn on the right, and my sister in fire, Elizabeth Azuz, she is lighting a wormwood torch. And usually we will start our fires with the wormwood. It's medicine. We send up prayer with that smoke, and we'll start our fires with that. And then after that, we'll use the drip torches to carry the fire across the land, starting at the top of the slope and working our way down. You'll see on the left a burn that we did around an elder's home, creating a safety barrier around it. We had already burned up behind his house down into the backside, clear to about within 6 feet of his house. He and his wife were in their house just doing whatever it was they was doing. And then we went down around to the other side and started carrying the fire down that hill. In the bottom of this picture, you'll see the Yurok tribe wildland fire truck and the cultural fire. We have a little slip-on engine. It holds a couple 100 gallons of water and a pump to pump water at high pressure. And this is what we use with people who know how to use fire. Fire needs to be returned to the hands of the people, government agencies, non-government agencies, tribes, individuals. We all need to start working together to return fire to the land in the different capacities that we assume. Native people no longer own or occupy all of the land. And so non-native people need to take upon themselves the responsibility to care for the land that they own as well. Fire should not just be in the hands of the government. It needs to be returned to the hands of the people as well. Thank you.
Great. Well, Margot, you couldn't have had a better preface for what I'm about to share. I think it's almost like we coordinated that together. My name is Lania Quinn-Davidson, and I am the fire advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension. And I'm also the director of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council and a board member of the Trees Foundation for quite some time now. So it's a real pleasure to be on with everyone. And some of my very favorite fire people are on this panel today. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about some of the same themes that Margot brought up in her presentation and really focus on bringing fire back to the people. As Margot said, you know, fire's been professionalized for a long time in the Western US and in California. And we've gotten to this space where we think that the only people who can work with fire or use fire as a tool are fire professionals, people who put fires out for a living. And there's just something so fundamentally flawed with that thinking and that approach to fire. And you can go to the next slide. So the work that I do is really kind of premised on two different things. One is that our landscapes in California are so integrally connected to fire. And, you know, fire has shaped those places, you know, everything we care about. When we look around the North Coast and around most of California, there's some kind of fire story to tell on every landscape. And for the most part, those fire stories are connected to people. And, you know, thousands and thousands of years of human stewardship with fire, normal people using fire to you know, bring about the resources and values that they care about on the landscape. So fire really is at its very essence a tool of the people, and we need to reclaim that. We need to move away from that notion that it should only be fire professionals. And so in my work, I really try to bring fire back to landowners, to communities, and also, you know, to engage with agencies and work with them, but to acknowledge this fundamental right to having a relationship with fire, and that relationship with fire is actually what's going to carry us forward and give us a chance moving into this complicated future with fire. Next slide. So how do we do that? How can we reclaim fire in California? How can we bring it back to the people, bring it back to the communities, and rebuild a more healthy relationship with fire? I think in my work, kind of three main areas that I've tried to work on. And one is to inspire people and to demonstrate that this is possible. So to actually open our minds to the idea that people can have a good relationship with fire, and that average normal people like us, you know, can use fire in a safe and effective way and really rebuild that connection. And that we need to provide points of entry for people. So for so long, that professionalization of fire meant that we kept most people out of fire. We kept cultural practitioners and tribes out of fire. We kept landowners out of fire, community members. You know, people have had no opportunity to learn those skills and to kind of dig in on these fundamental parts of the California landscape. So we really need to provide points of entry for people. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we also need to change policy, because we've actually structured our policies in California and throughout the West and a lot, you know, across the country to keep people out of this space and to make it unavailable. And so we need to be working on all of those levels to bring fire back. Next slide. So for me, one of the things that I did to find inspiration and to kind of do that demonstration piece was really to go outside of California, to try to learn about how communities were using fire in other places and how this might look in other parts of the country. So my colleagues and I went to the Great Plains. We went out to Nebraska in 2017 to try to learn a little more about these landowner cooperatives for prescribed fire, prescribed burn associations, PBAs. And I know many of you, I was looking through the names on, you know, everyone who's on this webinar, many of you are involved in the Humboldt County PBA or in other PBAs around the state. And this notion really came from the Great Plains. We went out there and saw what they were doing and so impressed with just landowners, ranchers, farmers getting together and burning pretty impressive projects with no outside help. Just, they had trained themselves and were implementing hundreds of acres together just in their blue jeans and their cowboy boots. So we came back from that trip and decided to bring that model back to California. And that was a model that had actually originated on some level in California, back in the mid 1900s with the range improvement associations that a lot of the ranchers had used, but that had really petered out and had pretty much gone away in California. So we brought this Nebraskan inspiration back to California and to Humboldt County, and you can go to the next slide. And in 2017 and 2018, we formed the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association, which at that time was the first PBA in the Western US, and definitely the first one in California. Now, some of the work that Will had been doing out in the mid-Klamath is very similar to this. So it's not to say this is the first group that had ever burned in this fashion, but really the first to bring that Prescribed Burn Association model back to California. And we demonstrated that this was possible. We have done about 33 different projects over the last few years, ranging in size from a half acre to 350 acres, and just really showing that you can put fire in the hands of community members and landowners, and you can have success with it. And you can really inspire and motivate people. So the Prescribed Burn Association, now we have about 90 members, throughout Humboldt County, and even some folks from outside the county. I saw a couple of you on here on the webinar today. So we've been able to pull together this wonderful community of people who can get together and burn together. And I think it's so important. It was so important as a proof of concept that this was actually possible, because people thought it was pretty nuts when we were first, doing our first burns in 2017, staffed entirely by community members. It was, people were on edge about it, but now it's kind of become a household terminology in the fire world, this Prescribed Burn Association idea. Next slide. So some of the core philosophies of the PBA model that I think are important to share are, for one, that everyone is welcome and has something to contribute. And this is kind of where we get to that points of entry piece, where you need to provide opportunities for people to get out and participate in burns and really, feel the fire at their fingertips to build that connection. So it's so important that we make that available to anyone who wants to participate, whether they're young or old or fit or unfit. It doesn't matter. We can take anyone on a prescribed burn and make sure that their time is valued, used well, and they feel valued, and that it's a meaningful experience. And we've had a lot of success with that. Every burn is also a training burn. So people don't have to, have a bunch of qualifications to come out and burn with us. We're going to take them and meet them where they're at, and incorporate them in a way that's safe, but also where they're learning and training, and where we all are learning and training. That's what, every time you do a burn, you're learning something new, even if you're very experienced. I think it's also important for people to remember that prescribed fire does not have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be bureaucratic. And so, fundamentally, people have been using fire for forever. And we don't need tons of money to do that. We don't need a bunch of bureaucracy to do that. Sometimes it's just as simple as getting out there and burning, even just by yourself or with a couple other people. There's something really beautiful about that. And we're bringing fire back as a land management tool, not just a fire management tool. So I think it's really about stewardship and connecting with place and recognizing that essential relationship with fire. Next slide. So you can see here that these PAs have just kind of exploded since we had the Humboldt County one, 2018, we officially formed. And now we have PBAs all over the state. So the blue ones are places where they're officially formed. Orange, they're kind of in formation, and the yellow, they're having conversations about it. And there's just been so much momentum. And I think we've been able to take that inspiration and spread it around the state. I'd imagine in the next couple of years, most of the state will be blue. So that's been really exciting. And if you're curious about, if you're outside of this area, you can go to that calpba.org to learn more about prescribed burn associations and to find out if you have one in your county. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk quickly. I know I only have 1 more minute, but I wanted to highlight some of our policy wins this year because there have been some really great things. Margot mentioned the state certified burn boss program. That is that was in the works for a couple years, but finally was approved this year. And that is a program for really experienced practitioners to become certified by the state. We also just got wind of the $20 million prescribed fire claims fund. Governor Newsom just signed it in the last couple of weeks. And that is a fund that will help fill the insurance gap for prescribed fire. And I don't have time to go super in detail on this, but it's essentially a state-backed claims fund that kind of acts like a state-backed insurance fund for prescribed fire. Huge win. That's such a big deal. And then these 2 bills, Assembly Bill 642, that has some pieces about cultural burning and tribal sovereignty and a prescribed fire training center. And then also Senate Bill 332, which would provide liability protections for prescribed burners. That one's sitting on Newsom's desk and he hasn't signed it yet. And we're all wondering what's going to happen. He has 1 more week to sign it. Hugely important. So put out some good energy for SB 332 to get signed. And I think that's my last slide. So if you want to go to the next one, feel free to email me if you have questions and we can pick up some of this stuff in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Bailey with the Watershed Research and Training Center. I'm kind of filling in for the Institute for Sustainable Forestry's role, but I'm going to profile some of the viewpoint. Next slide. So people in the future, feel free to contact me at Tim at the Watershed Center. Next slide. Okay, so I run 2 programs, the California Forest LiDAR Analytics Collaborative, which is invested in developing forest knowledge co-production with implementation partners. And I'm also the shared stewardship advisor for the 6 northernmost forests in California. And we develop cross-boundary projects and facilitate kind of engagement with implementation partners. Next slide. What I really want to talk about is envisioning what we need to achieve for climate adaptation needs over the next 10 years. We're in a position where we have a unique policy portfolio to really engage with our problems. And I think that this is a globally significant situation because a lot of other communities are traveling behind California in developing policies to fund climate resilience. And, you know, we are clearly in the midst of the climate emergency. We've seen what, since at least 2015, what failing to plan for climate hazards creates with community dislocation and you know, ecosystem declines resulting from extreme fire behavior. At this point, we really need to, I think we have an opportunity as a community to demonstrate a path forward using policy tools at hand. Next slide, please. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that finances the Forest Health Program and many other the innovative programs that California has deployed has really been envisioned as a model for larger Green New Deal issues. And we're in a situation where we really need to start in the forest resilience space. We hear the term increased pace and scale constantly. And to me, what that means is that we need to start biting off ambitious but achievable goals, and on a yearly basis, continue to increase the scope of our efforts and take more responsibility for larger and larger landscapes. If you know, the alternative is you know, we can see in situations where you know, extreme wildfire behavior has you know, destroyed community after community. in California over the last few years. And frankly, we have just begun to experience climate change. Things are going to get much more extreme in years to come. Next slide. So when I envisioned this, I spent a lot of time thinking about community-based organizations because in our current environment, neither CAL FIRE nor the Forest Service are going to grow into the role of developing climate resilient solutions. They are essentially overwhelmed with their current job, and as we see these very significant investments in climate resilience being made, the organizations that are envisioning the solution and doing the job are largely community-based organizations or local jurisdictions of some kind. They're not the big agencies, and each of these entities needs to or I'd say every community needs to have a portfolio of organizations that are preparing to do the work. And this is, in many cases, frankly, payroll, communications, just standard organizational issues, and then also developing technical and implementation capacity to actually get these jobs done, because these are difficult but important work and frankly, life affirming. Next slide, please. Now I wanted to just show a profile of a project that I have two projects in northern Mendocino that are kind of good examples. So this, I wanted to show how a regional strategy document relates to an actual project that was just awarded for implementation. On the right side of the screen are like what I would call, on the top is like a cartoon of how Caltrans visualizes the landscape that it has some responsibility for. And below is basically a data-driven analysis of where their resource needs are. On the left side of the screen is, so they have basically gone through the highways of the state and kind of identified where there are fuels issues. On the left side of the screen is a fairly simple map of what a ridgetop fuel break opportunity to develop a treatment that would basically improve the forest resilience on either side of the in either watershed and potentially reduce the size of any fire that occurred nearby. So this is on the northernmost end of Highway 1. Next slide. So one of the things that we're doing is we're using data-driven approaches to get from these cartoon models to basically populating databases of trees in the treatment. And in this case, we looked at 47,000 trees individually, and then we basically built a model of how to implement the project based on access and our preferred thinning model. And so we basically are moving very quickly, and frankly, before we're funded for implementation, to having being able to do single tree assessment of how both the carbon implications and the fire resilience implications of a treatment are. Now, this project was just awarded in early August, and it is nearly $5 million in funding. And one of the really interesting things here is that this is likely to be somewhere near 80 person years of work. And this is for depressed rural economies. These are really big deals. And this is like important work that, building these pipelines where this kind of work can be paid for has very significant possibilities for rejuvenating our social infrastructure and really, giving people right livelihoods. This is remarkable work. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is so much of the policy space around forest resilience is focused on the financial system and building these vehicles to get this, stock market like investment in carbon resilience. But really, what I envision the core of this is we need to build vehicles we need to connect the financial system to pay for this, but there's this whole chain of things that organizations need to make happen in order for people to do this work. And it is, to my eyes, and I think the Watershed Center as an organization that has originated in work in the woods programs in the early 1990s, building a kind of a labor environment where we can get communities or we can provide pathways for communities to engage in the landscapes that they've find as home is really important. And the number of situations that have kind of gone awry with responding to emergency with national networks. Many of our implementation contractors are, come from all over the country and are not necessarily attuned to our local environmental needs. And I think that building the economic infrastructure to do this work is going to be key. And there are some really interesting and I think exciting opportunities emerging. There's a CalWorks coalition that is forming to do kind of economic analysis in the wood products sector in Humboldt Bay. And, I think we really need to build the organizations that can kind of support this work from the ground up. Next slide. So this is a similar project also in northern Mendocino in 10 Mile Creek. This was one of the NCRP pilot projects. And basically doing the same kind of analysis where we get to single tree selection models for small rural landowners was kind of the goal of this. And the idea here is that by developing forest management plans, we provide the pathway to secure co-funding of forest improvement projects from the federal government with the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the state has a program called CFIP, which is the CAL FIRE administers. And they're different, but they basically help finance forest improvement projects. But in order to start that process, you need to file a forest management plan. This is another opportunity where it basically increases the value of any forest investments that private landowners will do. So anyways, I'll leave it there. But basically, quickly, we can get to rapid assessments, and we can basically provide the model that the NCRP funded with Eel River Recovery Project, basically enable 15 parcels to get a forest management plan with shared data resources. All right, that's all. Thank you.
Hey everyone, this is Will Harling. I see I'm part of the Cultural Fire Management Council. I hope you'll let me in, Margot. Actually, we do help Margot from time to time, but I don't think I do enough to really earn more than the t-shirt that she gave me. I am a co-lead of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and director of the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. Thanks to Carrie and the Trees Foundation for sponsoring this event and giving me a chance to hang out with some of my favorite humans. I probably have 15 to 20 minutes of slides. If we want to finish sooner, I can do an abbreviated version of this presentation. What say you, Carrie?
Hey, Will, and apologies for that typo in the slideshow, but just want to say Anna's doing an amazing job with the slides. So thank you, Anna. And I think that we could do like, try to keep it to 15 minutes. You think you could do that?
Great.
Okay.
That's good. And Anna, let me apologize in advance. There are some animations on some of these slides. So let's get started. Yeah, so I just put together a fun presentation about my thoughts about, how we get to that better fire future, and some examples from the Klamath Mountains of times when that's happened. And this photo of Rodney Grant from the Kuduk tribe, teaching the next generation of tribal fire practitioners how to bring fire back to Shunik along the Klamath River in Orleans is a good memory, a recent memory of mine from this June. Next. I did want to talk a little bit about this, our community wildfire response in 2013 to the Butler fire. And let me just paint the picture that we had just successfully responded as a community to the arson fire that became the Orleans fire, burnt down an elder's home, and 2 days later, an arsonist drove up the Salmon River and lit 4 major fires that turned into the Salmon River complex and the Butler fire. I remember looking at that fire up by Trip Point, the arson fire by Trip Point, after we tried to catch it on initial attack, but it went up the 100% slope and got away. And by the next day, after some Facebook outreach, we had more than 40 locals show up at Butler Flat, and an assemblage of about 15 homes. And by 2 days later, when the incident management team arrived, we had an over 1 mile fuel break built along an old mining ditch, structure protection in place, fire lines in place, local engine stage, and the team, job pretty much hit the meadow there. They saw everything that we had done, and I think what ensued was this kind of uneasy dance where they're used to just chasing everybody off, and we said no, we feel comfortable staying here. We have a safety zone, and we're here to be that fire future. And in the subsequent days, it became this incredible bonding of fire cultures that you can see in one of these pictures, the 6th supervisor Merv George showed up with one of his deputies to check in about the craziness. We had a check-in station at the front gate where we were checking people in and out to ensure accountability. We set up 3/4 of a mile long line of sprinklers powered by 3 pumps to protect the community water line that fed all the structures and the suppression forces. And we successfully brought fire back to our residences in a good way. And it turned out the Klamath National Forest Supervisor Patty Grantham ended up making t-shirts for everybody based on some local art that we used, that said, together we held the fire line. So that, merging of fire cultures and the fact that, there is a very good role for our communities to play in fire coming back to our homes. If we do it right, if we understand, the needs of the incident management teams and figure out where we can work together. Next slide. One of the things that Carrie asked me to talk about was the community liaison program. Now, this started on the Salmon River after the major wildfire season of 2008, where there was just so much conflict between the 7 or 8 incident management teams that came through that summer and the community, that we work together with our local forests, the Klamath and the 6 Rivers, to figure out, how we could establish a model for timely communication between the agencies, the local forests, and the community during wildfire events. And this program has grown over the past decade plus and actually been exported to other communities, including up in Washington in New Mexico and continued to grow. But you know, the value is that we now have a way to share local knowledge in a timely manner. And we have a way to establish trust and respect with those incident management teams. And we have a seat at the table, you know, during those cooperator meetings where we can, you know, help with things like, you know, emergency evacuations where, for instance, I included these 3 pictures from Rainbow Mine that was surrounded, you know, completely surrounded by wildfire during the 2014 Wildfire. And Dick Watts, the old man there on the lower left, you know, was going down with the ship no matter what happened, you know, and he had a standoff with the local sheriff, and it looked like doom and gloom. But, you know, we were able to come in as liaisons and facilitate a conversation that allowed Dick to see how the team was going to care for his resources and establish those trigger points when, you know, when and where he would leave and how and why. And what they were doing to protect his resources. And so in the end, you know, one of the structures on Dick's property ended up burning down. It was a non-inhabited house, but it was a positive. It ended up being a positive experience for everyone because, you know, he accepted that risk, and even though the fire conditions were extreme, there was positive outcomes at the end of the day. So the community liaison program, you know, asked myself or Karuna Greenberg from River Restoration Council. It's a great program. Next slide. There must be a little delay here on my end. So the Klamath Treks is another one of those future successes, and similar to Margot, you know, we're trying to get good fire on the ground in the Western Klamath Mountains by any means necessary. And given the fire conditions here, that means to a certain extent playing by the rules that state and federal fire agencies mandate in order to get permits to burn. So for the past 8 years, we've been organizing training exchange events, and now we're merged with the all hands, all lands model to take advantage of our available burn windows. I love this photo from the Bullpine burn in 2019, just because of the diversity of faces you see here. You know, the dog jumping up on Rick there, and you know, just the power of bringing fire back to the land together. Next slide. So just this year, you know, some of our we actually merged the all hands, all lands, and Trex models, you know, to be able to take advantage of burn windows as they arise. And you know, typically Trex would be 2 weeks, and you know, we may or may not get good burn windows in there. But since we had people from coming all over the country and around the world to participate, we had to set dates. Well, this year we had 180 applicants, and with COVID, we decided we can only have no more than 80 people there at any given time. We decided to open it up and do 7 one-week-long trainings, the first of which starts next Monday. We're going to be burning up in Happy Camp. We've got our permits from CAL FIRE and air quality. And we're going to merge these models to be able to take advantage of those burn windows as they arise, and stretch out those 180 applicants to have burn teams for those 7 weeks. Next slide. So this is just a slice of, you know, the resources that these volunteers are bringing to the event. You know, 2 Type 3 engines, 6 Type 6 engines, slip-ons, burn trailers, UTVs, fire cache, and then we augment with contractual resources as needed to form burn teams around the burns that we're planning to implement. Next slide. And, you know, part of the magic that happens is, you know, we can be a contingency resource for Margot when Margot's burning downriver during the Yurok treks. And the more communities that come on board, you know, we can be each other's contingency resources when we're organizing around these windows with local resources. Next slide. A huge goal of these treks events is to provide opportunities for cultural fire knowledge to reach more people. This is just one example of Bill giving us a lesson on how fire was brought back to the Orleans Valley every year, and the sequencing of the burns and the objectives of those burns down at Tishonik before lighting, to ensure that we had fresh in our minds what the goals of that burn that day was. Next slide. So this is just a slice. You can go to the next slide here too, to see some of the resources that have signed up for this year's treks. Over the past 8 years, we've had over 500 participants. We burned over 2,800 acres on 140 different properties with no escapes. And it's really about touching people with good fire, because so many people are experiencing negative fire, bad fire out there, that you need to balance that. And all these people are signing up for their local volunteer fire departments. Some of them are becoming state and federal and tribal firefighters. But this is a huge gateway for people to get engaged with fire. Next slide. And yeah, this is just to say, part of that future vision is that, landowners like Sam Berry on the upper left are engaged in these programs, but in effect, he was the firing boss on a prescribed burn directly below his house. So landowners have a structured way to take responsibility for fire on their own lands. And, a lot of people looking at all these pictures might be a little freaked out, fire right next to homes. But the reality is, these are all prescribed burns that are making these homes much more safe. Fire next time. Next slide. So the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, which was formed in 2007, has been a vehicle for this larger scale planning with all of our local players on this 1.2 million acre landscape in the Western Klamath Mountains. And through several years of intense collaborative meetings, we finally came upon our goal, which was to restore historic fire regimes in the Western Klamath Mountains. Next slide. And you can click twice more to bring up the other graphics there, Anna. Basically, we built support at all levels for upslope restoration actions. We've had California Forestry Association and other industry reps with local environmentalists, all coming together around shared values. And we've been able to plan several large scale projects and bring in over $12 million in the past 5 years to implement those projects and develop a workforce, including equipment, type 3 and type 6 engines and crews, to bring together the three elements of the cohesive strategy. Next slide. It means a lot of getting out in the field and kicking rocks and sticks and understanding where each other's coming from and shaping that shared vision. Next slide. I love that picture in the middle there, the beer tree. And just an example, we had blockades with the Orleans project, Orleans Community Fuels Reduction Project, where the tribe, blocked the loggers coming up because of some impacts to ceremonial trails. And then, 10 years later, we're having ribbon cutting events with the same players on shared projects. Next slide. And this example of Orleans, where we're, in our community wildfire protection plan, we're pre-planning our wildfire response with all affected parties. We're looking at those established fuel breaks along roads, rivers, ridges, property lines, trails. We're getting out and we're implementing cultural and prescribed fire in the spring and the fall and the early summer to have burn footprints to work off of. We're working with our wildfire footprints. And we're working to build those bridges between the local, state, tribal, federal agencies, by doing shared work days and training days and getting out and burning together. And ultimately, this is what creates the space for managed wildfire. When you have 1 to 2 miles of treatment up to that next ridge, we can start to think about, how, whether or not we choose to let fires burn at different times of year. I see that I am at time, so I think we could just call it there. I've got some other feel-good slides, but I'd just like to leave it here today and leave time for questions. Thank you all.
Will, and maybe as I invite other panelists to turn on their cameras, if you want to go through those last slides. Oh, yeah. And then we will just turn off.
Yeah, I mean, this, just, you can go to the next one. This is an example of our pods, as through the WQRP, we as a community worked with our forest to look at those, strategic operational delineations for how we might choose how to respond to wildfires, and develop field breaks, so that we can have more nuanced response, both the prescribed fire and wildfire. And then, you can just, that's, basically pods is a tool for us to communicate with various parties about when and where, and to allow manage wildfire and under what conditions, and, to collaboratively determine what those conditions are so that we're not building distrust on the back end. It's key, not, we have to get on the ground and ground truth those fire lines before we settle on them, because there's potential for cultural and ecological impacts. And then we're also working with Paul Hesberg and Susan Pritchard from PNW and the University of Washington to help us develop these state and transition model pathways, which help us to understand what pre-suppression vegetation forests look like, and make a choice together about the forests of the future, because only when we have a shared vision for what we're managing towards can we bring all these disparate groups together to manage towards that goal. Next slide. And you can just go through all these. This is just an example of one of those pathways that we've been working to create based on fire interactions. You can go to the next slide. I do want to give a shout out. Folks should check out the Good Fire Policy paper that many people on this call helped to put together, and was a script for the AB 642 that Lanya talked about earlier. Next slide. And it's really, I want to give a shout out to Margot and to Bill, Elizabeth, and many others of our tribal partners that are, basically, despite a century of genocide and being excluded from these decisions, are continually putting the best foot forward and engaging us with us non-native folks, to restore their culture and their lands. And so I think it's a huge opportunity in time for us to support and empower our tribal neighbors and partners in, getting fire and the power to use that fire back in their hands, and ultimately that's what's going to really protect us in the long run. That's it.
Okay, thanks so much, Will. And Anna, you can turn off the screen share now, and we can just invite our panelists with the time we have remaining, a nice 45 minutes to have a discussion and answer some of these questions. I'm also inviting Cybelle Immitt on as a panelist, since we don't have Kai here. She is certainly, as well as many other people, able to join in a really great discussion here. So Cybelle, just turn on your camera to join the panel. All right.
Hey, everybody.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera, and we'll, as everyone can see, there's a Q&A box. I will start to offer some questions, but also invite the panelists to, you know, respond and also ask questions of each other. But let's take this first question here. And anyone, all attendees can upvote questions as well. If you give it a thumbs up, it will come up higher in the list. So this question is, in forested areas that have not seen fire for many decades, land may be overgrown. How do you do controlled burns in these areas compared to traditional controlled areas? Is it more hazardous now doing controlled burns due to overgrowth?
I would like to give a first shot at that question. So traditional burned areas, we have only been putting fire on the land for 8 years. So that traditional fire regime came to a screeching halt for over 100 years. And all of our land is overgrown and thick with brush, so thick you cannot walk through it, you can't see through it. Animals, big animals can't live there. So these are the landscapes we are burning on. We put a fire line around it, cut the brush 10 feet, a 10-foot wide swath. We scrape it down to mineral soil for 2 feet within that 10 foot. We have hose lays, we have fire trucks, we have experienced fire people, and then we start the burn at the top of the slope and bring it slowly down the hill. These are the conditions that we work in every time we burn in our landscape. So it is possible. We've been burning for 8 years without an escape.
I'd just like to add to that, you know, there are several units we burned, you know, in the 50 to 100 acre scale where, you know, we did a perimeter treatment along the outside, like Margot just described, in order to contain the fire. But on the interior of the unit, we went in and we did pullback around those legacy resources, you know, late cereal, hardwoods, and conifers that we wanted to protect. But then you can bring fire back as an initial treatment. You know, we simply don't have time to treat every acre with a chainsaw or a machine. You know, the reality is that fire is outpacing us at the landscape scale. And so, you know, we've definitely turned a lot of our units and you know, we look at them differently now where, you know, maybe we need to bring fire back 2 or 3 times to reduce that fuel load in the interior of the unit. Because the first burn looks ugly because you're leaving a lot of dead standing. You come back in, you know, 3 to 7, 8 years later, burn it again. A lot of that stuff is on the ground by that point and helps carry the fire. Come back in a third time, you know, 5 to 15 years after that and burn it again. And then all of a sudden, you know, you're getting that gap between the ground fuels and the canopy fuels. You're actually able to walk through the landscape again, gather resources, you know, and the cool thing about that model is, you know, you can use the fuels in some places to do the work you need to do. Like one instance, I'm thinking about our West Sims unit. There was this entire meadow complex that had been completely overgrown with Douglas fir. But we came through and burned that, you know, in the middle of the night and where it was safe and, you know, in the middle of that unit, and we burned it at high severity. Those trees died and fell over and were burned up in a subsequent burn. And now all of a sudden we have elk coming down from the high country to the Orleans Valley again and eating the grass in those meadows that they use. And they're actually helping us maintain and restore those meadows. So, you know, I'd say don't be afraid to not treat some areas and choose that right window to get the effects that you want with the fire.
Okay, another question for the panel is, what's the process for establishing pods? What are the steps?
You know, briefly, there's 3 analyses that feed into pods. One is a suppression difficulty index. It looks at your percentage of catching a fire under preset fire conditions, a lot of times what they call the 97th percentile, pretty severe fire weather conditions. And what you'll see is that a lot of the ridge tops that typically get shaved and a dozer line put in are very low percentile for success, 10 to 30%. And those much stronger fuel breaks are things like rivers and rock outcrops and recent fire footprints. So you have the suppression difficulty index model. You combine that with your potential control locations, the place where you have access via roads or other resources to actually get people to those areas to hold those features. And then you have your hazard risk analysis, which is, what are those things that you want to protect, be that communities, cultural resources, ecological resources, and you marry all of those things together, and it starts to paint a picture of, for instance, where you could, we have areas in the Klamath Mountains that are completely bounded on all sides by recent fire footprints. If a fire started in that zone, there would be no way for the fire to get out and impact a community. And, and if you look at the other potential impacts in there and decide fire is a beneficial thing, that could burn in the middle of next fire season. It'd be great. Other areas, there's jackpots of fuel that haven't burned in 100 years right next to communities. If a fire starts in that zone, we want to jump on it with all we got, in the middle of summer to keep it from potentially burning down the community. So the pods helps us to make those decisions. And I'm really stoked. North Coast Resource Partnership has funded Chris Dunn and others to develop pods for the 11 county NCRP area. We will be having public meetings in the 5 regions of NCRP over this winter to get public input. So show up to those meetings, help us make pods.
Okay, great. And next question, a lot are coming in now. That's great. You can feel free to upvote questions you want to make sure get answered in the next 35 minutes we have together. And this one is, this might be a good one for Cybelle to answer as well as others. And you can quickly introduce yourself, Cybelle. Any advice on how to help a new community organization that wants to move towards a fire adapted community?
Sure, I can address that, and then I'm sure others on this panel will probably have more to say, possibly. But I'm Cybelle, and I work closely with the Humboldt County Fire Safe Council and have had some experience with helping some local firewise communities get off the ground. On the Humboldt County Fire Safe Council, we have representation from several of the local fire safe councils, and they take so many different forms. It really depends a lot on the character of the community and who the movers and shakers are in that community. Some are connected to a watershed group, and it's a program of, say, the Mattole Restoration Council or the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. Others are independent nonprofit organizations of their own, like the Willow Creek Fire Safe Council, who focus primarily on fire preparedness. There's others that are just affiliations of neighborhood community members who are helping one another. That's more consistent with the Firewise community model. I think there's a lot of interest from this last fire season in starting some new groups. And so it's sort of a matter of just figuring out which model to connect yourself to, and then set your intention to just work together to get stuff done, whatever that might look like for you, whoever those community spark plugs are, just kind of get them plugged in. And one of the roles that I play in that to a certain extent is sort of just the spider in the web, sort of connecting people. There's a lot of really amazing people out there like Margot and Will and Lania who are doing a lot of work in this space. And I hate to put more burden on them, but to be able to be mentors for some of those up and coming groups is going to be an important role. And one thing that's been on my mind a lot lately is how do we secure some funding, or maybe through the North Coast Resource Partnership or through some other means to really support those mentor opportunities. So not always asking people to come and talk to your community about how to get motivated and get organized to do work in this arena, to find a way to really support those who do know to come and share their knowledge, kind of like what you guys are doing today. But that's probably more long-winded than we need, but just to say that reaching out to people who are doing this work and trying to learn from them, and reaching out to the various programs that have information and resources, and that's something that we can kind of help connect people with. And then just really quick, just since Kai isn't here and I happen to be putting the final edits on the Humboldt County Fire Chiefs Association annual report this weekend, I just wanted to put a plug in for the importance and the value of the local fire services that we have in this whole region. And I'm focusing on Humboldt County this weekend, but I know that there's volunteers all throughout the region. And I think that they are somewhat maybe undervalued or just expected to be there by their communities to a certain extent. And this is a huge, huge effort. Most of the volunteer fire departments in Humboldt anyway are either all or partially volunteer, and they're doing a great job with what they have. And they play a really important role in a lot of what you're talking about today, including prescribed burn associations and technical rescue, if you have a medical emergency or a home fire, but also keeping those wildfires small because they're really spread across the landscape in all of these little communities, much more strategically located than say the Cal Fire stations or the Forest Service stations. So they can jump on those fire starts and keep them small when we don't want them to be burning during the season when they could get large. And then they play an important role in helping Cal Fire and the Forest Service manage those fires when they do happen. So just a shout out to those volunteer fire departments. And I'm looking at, their biggest challenge that I'm seeing in this annual report for 2020 is that recruitment of volunteers and retaining those volunteers is their biggest challenge. It's a lot to ask people to reach the levels of training that's expected. And so we need to find ways to support that volunteer spirit in our communities, and also maybe set up these fire departments with some potential paid staff or something that helps keep that structure. So there's some there to onboard volunteers and keep them trained and keep them interested in coming back and supporting their local fire departments. So that's something that's on my mind. And I know Kai is much more deep in the weeds with that than I am. And he's involved with it, but I just thought I had to say something since he's not here about the importance of those local fire resources.
And thank you so much for doing that. They're such an important part of it. And we're proud at Trees Foundation to have a volunteer firefighter on our team. And he's also our GIS specialist, Cullen Kramer. So big shout out to Cullen. He has been in the process of making a lot of updated maps for, I think, over a half dozen volunteer fire departments in the Southern Humboldt region recently. And if you're listening and you're part of a volunteer fire department and you need an updated map, please message me. We have approved doing that for volunteer fire departments with, we have a fund available, and we will be happy to serve you in that way. Next question I have here has been upvoted. So at least 3 people want to hear this. This question answered. In the last 30 years, we've created a backlog of landscapes that are choked with dead trees, primarily on public lands. Many of these areas are near rural communities and other forest resource values. These fuel conditions are very difficult to manage with prescribed fire due to accumulations of heavy woody debris that has a very high resistance to control and will burn with very high intensity in fire season, while being almost impossible to burn off season. It is estimated that this backlog in the West is currently over 10 million acres. How are we going to reduce the risk in these landscapes?
I'll take the, so with public lands issues, I mean, basically the BLM and Forest Service have significant human resources challenges, and ideally we should be developing partnerships in which local communities can kind of identify what the hazards and what the future desirable conditions that they're after, and come into a partnership arrangement with the management unit that controls the real estate. Humboldt County has a good neighbor agreement with the Forest Service. BLM has a phenomenal history of setting up. I mean, the Arcata BLM unit is one of the most sophisticated users of partnership agreements there is. You know, and you basically have to interact with your line officers, which would be the rangers or the forest supervisor, and make sure that they understand its priority. And then, you know, the political leadership in the community has influence as well. And so this is something that could be brought up through the supervisors, could be the county supervisors could be communicating to the Forest Service or BLM what your specific interests are. I think being, you know, I would like to say both Allie and Will have, you know, these experience bases of developing collaborative projects with their local units, and their experiences would be relevant. But there are tools, and the state of California has aggressively financed forest health projects all over the place. And if you're, you know, use the policy vehicles in place.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I will add one thing to add to that, which is, you know, there are some examples of units where we've had high severity wildfire next to communities. The Orleans fire burned about 600 acres on the north side of town. And the landowner decided not to log. And don't get me wrong, there is a place to log, you know, and you can be effective, you know, in the short term at logging if you do it with care, you know, in regards to our fisheries and sedimentation and soil compaction and all that stuff. But we were successful. Ever since 2013, we've burned 3 times in that snag patch successfully, and have reduced the risk. And so you still have dead standing trees, but those trees are resilient. They've got black char around the base. You know, they're being utilized by wildlife. While at the same time, you've thinned out the even age vegetation that was coming up in that burn scar. And not only that, fire shaped that recurring vegetation so that it's resilient to future wildfires. It's not like blanket planting, tree planting after timber harvest. You know, you've got Doug fir and oaks coming up in places where they're going to survive the next wildfire, and spaced out enough that you still have grasses in between. And we're actually restoring some of the meadow habitat that was there, you know, pre-fire exclusion. So it's not to say fire can't be used as a tool in those situations, but you know, you have to apply it frequently and with care in order to have positive outcomes.
I would just like to throw out there to encourage the Forest Service to open their lands up to woodcutters to cut that dead and down fuel for wood at no cost. Don't make people get a permit and pay money for it. Let them come in and cut the dead and down. It is a service to the community.
Great. The next question shifts to urban. Oh, I'm sorry, Bill, did you have something to add to that? You have to unmute.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I've just got a comment. State parks for a long time has been really resistant to fuel hazard projects, but recently there seems to be a big change, and there's some really interesting possibilities that are opening up right now. So there's one agency that may be doing a major reversal of policy.
Okay, so shifting to a question about a more urban landscape. This question is, a lot of defensible space displays shows homes with large landscapes around each house. Urban populations find this confusing. How do we educate urban homeowners about fire safety around their houses with just 1/8 of an acre? Some have many trees near their house.
I could take a stab at this one. I mean, I think one of the things that we're realizing in the, looking at how homes burn is that it's not just about defensible space. And so it's not just about trees being next to your house. You'll see those images of whole neighborhoods where one house is burned and another house is unburned and the trees are all still green, and it's a little confusing. So I think we need to really focus on the actual homes themselves, especially in those urban environments, and how people can make their homes more resilient, as well as managing some of the defensible space immediately adjacent to the home. But there's a renewed focus on the 5 feet around the house. And so little simple things you can do, like not having bark mulch up against your siding, and replacing your vent screens, and things that can make your home much more likely to survive in a fire that have nothing really to do with defensible space. So we're doing a lot out of our office, actually doing a lot of education on that and trying to provide materials. And Cybelle partnered with Yana in my office to develop some nice outreach materials on that.
Can I just dovetail on that a little bit?
Yeah.
It makes me think a lot about figuring out what you're managing for. Like a lot of our defensible space work over the years has been sort of managing for that ground fire that we do have in this region. They still do exist. So it's still important to do that. But then what Lainey was just talking about, and what we work with Yana a lot to develop outreach materials around, is that more wind-driven fire where you're dealing with an ember storm and those fires that actually burn the houses from the inside out. And then managing for the crown fire, working around your community or your home, dealing with the health of the forest itself. And I think that's a lot, that makes me think a lot of what, Margot is working on. And it makes me think of Kathy McCovey and how she talks about how, that there was a traditional practice of burning fairly consistently around villages, fairly close up to those villages, to protect them, so that when that lightning fire occurred, that it wasn't so vulnerable wildfire. It just seems like there's just this whole portfolio that we all have to be conscious of, no matter where we live. It's going to depend on where we are and what we're managing for. And we need to sort of figure out how to manage for all of those things at once, because we don't really know. What depends on the season, depends on the weather, depends on the condition of the fuels at the time when that incident does occur. So it's just so complex and multifaceted. And I'm just glad that there's so many people working on this and thinking about it, and trying to take action to make change.
So I just want to say, if people in urban areas want to get a hold of the Humboldt County Fire Safe Council, there's a lot of great information there. One of the things that we do is the Flash program, where we actually go around out here in the rural areas to do home assessments. And I'll say the first thing, and I can even show you, my home is not safe from wildfire. If a wildfire comes, an ember storm comes, it'll come from across the canyon, possibly, or from up. I'm going to get the heck out of here. But I will come back to my land. I mean, sometimes some things just go. In an urban situation, there are hopefully going to be a lot of resources hitting the ground to do that home hardening, and even funding to put. So this is a soffit up here that is not existing, and to make a soffit to make your home more ember resistant. I feel like everybody's catching up to this because of all the horrible wildfires, and you can only do what you can do in place where you are, one step at a time, and make it. You never know, but one step at a time, make improvements in your own home and helping your neighborhood as well.
Great. And Gail, you had something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to plug the UC Extension website on preparing your home for wildfires is a really great resource for urban areas and rural areas. And I think if you just search for UC Extension preparing your home for wildfire, that they have the landscape information and also the home hardening information, and it's very well presented with lots of good illustrations.
Fantastic. Okay, let's tackle another question. And this one may be quick, but might be an opportunity for another summary of, because I think it's been answered earlier. How difficult is it to start prescribed burning? Are there hurdles that must be overcome to initiate burning in your community?
I feel like I've talked a lot. I could talk to this, but if somebody else wants to take it, please do.
I would just like to say that it's important to learn what the rules and regulations are in your area. So we discovered that between the months of sometime in late October through April, you don't have to get a permit from CAL FIRE, which means you don't have to have a big expensive burn plan. So that's a really important piece of information. You still need an air quality permit, but when you don't have to have that big expensive burn plan, that opens up opportunities for individuals to do smaller burns. And so it's really important to know how to do those safely. And there are various avenues which Lenya and some of us others have talked about to get some of that experience. So that's the key part, and I'll hand it over to Will.
You know, on the issue of public opinion, I've been told by, I'll just take, for example, 2020, after the Red Salmon fire and the Slater fire, you know, both the CAL FIRE unit chief and the Forest Service came to me and said, you know, our communities just aren't ready for more smoke from prescribed fire this fall. And so I felt differently from my discussions with the community, and I went to the wildfire meetings that were still going on with all the CAL FIRE and the Forest Service folks in the room. And instead of asking questions to the agency folks, I turned around and I asked the residents that were there. I was like, what do you guys feel about us putting prescribed fire and culture of fire on the ground this fall, you know, once these wildfires are gone? You know, we're hearing that, you know, you guys don't want to see more prescribed fire. And in both of those cases, there was probably, you know, 60 plus people out in front of the Forks Elementary School on the Red Salmon complex. And there was nearly 100 folks up at the football field and Happy Camp. And there was almost unanimous support for prescribed fire. And so the reality is most people in our neck of the woods get it. You know, they understand you're going to get fire one way or the other. And it's not if, but when, and all we can control is how it comes. And so I guess what I'd say is, you know, reach out to your communities. It's a grassroots effort to build that support, but it can be done. And especially as more and more wildfires happen, you know, people are educating themselves about what the solutions are. And there's been a lot of great media. And so, you know, we can't undersell our community's acceptance of prescribed and cultural fire. Now there's, you know, there will always be a few detractors that, you know, have their, you know, single issue concerns. And there are ways to change those detractors into supporters. You know, for one, you know, bringing a commercial HEPA filter to somebody's home that has respiratory issues, if they're concerned about being impacted by air quality, you know, just flips the dial and changes, you know, somebody that has a legitimate concern to somebody who's a supporter. You know, other folks like the winemaking community, you know, the reality is we live in a wildfire environment. You know, we can't stop burning to protect one person's profit off winemaking. Now, some of our local vintners have switched to growing white grapes, which ripen earlier and are less susceptible to smoke taint, and have evolved to, you know, our frequent fire environment. So, you know, there's many ways to, you know, address those issues and get the public on board for what we need to do.
I think there's another thing that we really need to emphasize is that just how much more effective, Will alluded to this earlier in the pods discussion, but this year we're getting just an enormous amount of data about how much more effective prescribed fires are over other treatments or mechanical thinning with prescribed fire. But we're not building the fuels structures that we think we are sometimes with mechanical thinning alone. And there's going to be a huge amount of data coming out of the lava fire. There's a lot of anecdotes I've heard out of the Dixie fire. This is going to be a big story that we really need to message widely, that the most effective strategy for making control structures is with prescribed fire.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with a different topic, and that is inaccurate maps that the agencies depend on. This is a major concern. And, you know, although we have one GIS specialist that's beginning to support individual neighborhoods and volunteer fire departments, this person would like to know, is there any concerted effort by the major agencies to correct their maps, or can our group help to push them to doing that and budgeting for that? Anyone want to take that?
I could touch on it a little bit and then see if others have anything to say. I am aware that this is a big problem, and I think it's a combination of the county map layers and the map layers that CAL FIRE uses for dispatch. It sounds like that is what they're talking about mostly, is when a volunteer fire department is dispatched and there's inaccurate information, it can delay that response. I'm aware that I know that CAL FIRE often is present at the Southern Humboldt Fire Chiefs Association and asking for input from those fire departments to come and correct map issues. And I've heard them put that request out there several times. So I think engaging for those fire departments to really engage with the CAL FIRE Dispatch Center is really important. They will work with the fire department to put together a response plan for them that kind of tailors the way that they're dispatched within their area. I know that they have staff turnover and there's always going to be problems with that. So there does need to be maybe more of a comprehensive solution to this problem. I know that Bryceland Fire received some grant funds to address this in a little bit more of a deliberate way for their jurisdiction, and that they are working with county mapping folks to at least mitigate when there's inaccurate road names on county maps. And I'm not sure what the relationship is between the CAL FIRE maps and the county maps, but the county is considered sort of the official map. And there's a process that you have to go through to change those names or correct those names that involves potentially petitioning the people who live on that road, because it does have a whole trickle-down effect of people having to potentially change their addresses. So it is a huge problem that's going to take some time to sort out. And it's been a problem for a long time. So I'm not sure exactly what the solution is, but I think that acknowledging it and keep pushing on people, talk to your board of supervisors members, see if we can get more funding, look to Bryceland, who funded them, what was that project, can we scale that up to the county or something like that would be a good idea.
I'd just like to comment that CAL FIRE tells us their maps are based on the county map, and that if we want roads correctly drawn, let alone correctly labeled, that we have to get the county map changed. So that's what people are working on. And in answer to the question, I don't see any initiative coming from any of the agencies. I think the initiative is coming from the people. And it hasn't really sparked anything in the world of agency people who have salaries and funding and that kind of thing. It's been volunteers poking. So I just think, well, keep poking.
Okay, great. The next question is generally about the Northern Mendocino County Forest Health Collaborative, a new project, though I know it's been in the planning stages for a long time. This question is, I guess, initially addressed to Tim. What pod would be fitting and geographic extent for a pod? So if you can first kind of just go over what that Northern Mendocino County Forest Health Collaborative is about, and that would be great.
Okay, so this was really kind of initiated between Bureau of Land Management and the Piercy Volunteer Fire Department. Kind of started this, and then there was a parallel project where the Redwood Forest Foundation was planning a forest health, and they submitted a 2019 forest health proposal for the part that I showed this slide on that covered Redwood Forest Foundation land. So basically, both of them are ridgetop shaded fuel breaks that are intended to become control structures, and they're trying to improve the odds of containment on either of them. On the east side and the BLM parcels, they're working with 2008 lightning fire post-fire landscape, and so it's basically using it's using a variety of strategies. I'm sorry, what were the specifics of this that I'm supposed to answer? What's the origin of it?
They were interested in knowing how this would relate to a pod, if there's several pods in the area of the project, or if it would be a specific pod.
Yeah, well, so the pods, the way I would interpret it, and Will can edit this afterwards. Normally, you'd think of a pods as something about a 6,000 to 10,000 acre unit, which you kind of do your analysis framework, and it's bounded by potential control lines. And in the South Fork corridor, you have some extraordinarily challenging landscapes with both Red Mountain and there's the topography there is brutal. And so basically Highway 101 and the South Fork Eel are a primary, the most natural containment lines. But 101, if that ends up being hazard, will, kind of isolate several 100,000 people from the rest of California. So, it's a challenging landscape. So this was basically working from 101 east and west along two geologic structures that were kind of visualized as being the best available circumstance. The other thing that's working there is there's the South Fork Eel Wilderness, which the core of Red Mountain, and that creates some complications. So essentially, Bell Springs Road on it is kind of an ideal pod site. Lots of meadows, open landscapes, and a lot of areas that could potentially be treated in another project. And so the Red Mountain Road project kind of connects Highway 101 to Bell Springs in a kind of one of the more challenging. It's the only feasible intervention site for suppression, really. And similarly, Highway 1 is a similar structure. And there's plans to essentially be the core ridge, which I believe on the Redwood Forest Foundation is the Willits, and it's the WRP road. But the ridge line that you can see to the west that bounds between the Usaw Creek and the South Fork Eel is another kind of line that over time in future successive efforts they'll be like reinforcing.
Okay, well, the clock is ticking. We're just about out of time. We have 5 more minutes. If we didn't get to your answer, your question, if you didn't get your question answered, I will save the questions and try to get that back to you via email by sending them to our panelists. And I just want to thank everyone for being here. I want to give the panelists an opportunity to ask a question of another panelist if you still want to, or I can ask another question from the list. Okay, sounds like everyone's ready to answer. How about, oh, here's an interesting one. Do we need to support more lumber cutting, especially if done to create fire breaks? Like, is this climate crisis have sort of this challenge, and are we supposed to cut more of the forest? Let's take on that question of what's the proper way to go about thinning.
Don't all answer at once. Yeah, I look at thinning as a tool in the toolbox. You know, through Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, you know, we did an analysis in our 1.2 million acres and found that approximately only 30% of the landscape was even available for thinning due to slope, access, and many other factors. And so, you know, the reality is, you know, where thinning is a tool in the toolbox, we need to look at, you know, what those objectives for the thinning are. Are we thinning from below? You know, are we prioritizing, you know, cultural use species like oaks, you know, in those thinnings? I would recommend, if you're looking for prescriptions for thinning in mixed conifer hardwood forests, that you can check out the Somes Bar Integrated Fire Management Project, which is online. It's a federal project on the Six Rivers National Forest. We spent a lot of time, you know, meshing traditional ecological knowledge with Western forestry for those mechanical thinning prescriptions. And I think there's a lot of applicability to other mixed conifer hardwood stands in the Northwest and down through the Coast Range. So, you know, the reality is some places you're just, forgive my French, but polishing the turd if you're doing manual fuels reduction and prescribed burning and not affecting the overstory. You know, there's places, especially directly around homes, along critical access egress routes, where you can't stop a fire unless you start to thin that overstory. Now, that said, we also have several examples where we've been thinning the overstory by 10 to 15% with every prescribed fire that we implement. And so, you know, a lot of people can't visualize how that happens, but come out to the Klamath and we'll walk around on the ground and show you some units.
Can I chime in on that really quick? Definitely not an expert. I do. This is sort of the $1 million question, right? I mean, I think we do need to have some value added. It's an economic question. It's a feasibility question. It's like, what's the motor that's going to drive our ability to address all of this overgrown forest that we're dealing with? So I think, like Will said, it's a tool in the toolbox. I know that my father, wherever he is right now, is still waiting for us to figure this out, this value added question of how we can manage these forests so that we actually have an economic output that is still leaving us with healthy forests that are resilient to wildfire and communities that aren't so vulnerable to wildfire in this wildfire environment that we live in.
I just want to really thank all our panelists. Margot had to hop off a few minutes earlier. She says goodbye. Thanks to everyone. There is a poll. We would love to hear what future webinars you're interested in. So if folks see that poll button and can quickly answer those 2 questions, that would be great. And we will work on getting the recording up on our website as soon as we can. Just want to say thank you all so much. You can turn on your microphones and say so long, and see you at the next fire resiliency webinar. It's been a real treat to hear from all of you. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.